Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Great Ideas of Politics and Ethics. Today, we're going to talk about Rousseau and his discourse on inequality. And the opening passage, right, of the book, the epigraph, is um, a reference to Aristotle. So he says, "Not in depraved things, but in those well oriented according to nature, are we to consider what is natural." And the most important word here is nature. We will talk about that epigraph in a second, but I just wanted to show you because I wanted to give you some suggestions for your essay, okay? And I wanted to show you what an epigraph is, in case you don't know what that is, in case you didn't remember, right? And you'll see it here as one of the suggestions I give you here is to use an epigraph if you want. Okay, so my suggestions are number one that you create your own title, and that title can be one of the two things or both, right? So either informative or creative. Okay, so don't four visions of justice, right? That's informative, so that's fine. But if you can come up with your own title, which tells me either one of these two things, right? Your title should do either tell me, your title should tell me what your essay is roughly about. So Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality, we know that it's about inequality, right? So it's informative. But if it's not informative, but at least it's right creative, that's also fine. So some titles, so you read it, right, and then you only understand or fully understand the title when you get to the end of the essay, and that's also nice, right? That also works, right? Sometimes it's not informative, but you read it and you don't really understand the title, but then throughout the essay or when you conclude, you're now I understand, now I get it, right? Then that's also cool. If you want to do something like that, some students sometimes come up with titles like that. I also like that. So one of these two things, it's important. Students often do not add their titles, and it's not mandatory, but it's really important. When you are online in a or reading reading newspapers or online or you are on Twitter or whatever it is, when you think about it, what you see are the titles, right? And then titles that sound interesting, you click on them, right? So titles are important because they already tell you a little bit what they're an invitation, right, to the essay. They're going to tell me what the paper is about, and that's point two. In your introduction, you want to use what's called a thesis statement, right, which is basically just to explain, right, so you can expand on your title. If your title gives me an idea of what the essay is about, you usually want to start with your first paragraph by explaining to me, right, what's the goal here, okay? Then the third recommendation is that you use at least one direct citation, and you can use many. Okay, do not overuse it, right? You don't want half of your. You can easily see this, right? Because you're going to see, let's say that you can see that half of your pages are citations and the other half are your own words, then that's a lot, right? Because that basically means that Turnitin will tell me that 50% of your essay is plagiarism, right? And that's not plagiarism, right? But if you 50% of your essay are direct citations, that's just too much, right? That just means it's not original. So it's not like there's any perfect number or anything. You shouldn't worry about this. But good essays typically have, 20%, 30%, that's fine. 10 to 20%, I think great essays usually have something like that, with direct citations. But that's a very, very rough indication, right? You can use even just one if you want, and that's fine. Okay, you could use one as an epigraph, right? Because then, again, if you use an epigraph, that has the advantage that it will be a good introduction to your text, will give me an indication about what really matters, right? So that's an idea. Or you can use it at the end of your essay. That's also a good strategy that I usually recommend to my students. None of these are mandatory. You're totally free to do whatever you want on your essay. Just giving some general suggestions, okay? So sometimes you're struggling to, find like how do you let's say you can't find a nice way to end your article, okay, your essay. If you can come up with a nice way to conclude, that's even better. But, one option that you can always use that's kind of a hack, let's put it like this, is that you can use a final citation, direct citation to conclude your article. That's always a nice way to end essays. Or opening up with an essay, right? Choose a very good essay, your favorite passage of the book, and then either start your essay or conclude with it. That's always a nice thing you can do. By no means it's a rule, but it's a thing you can do that usually works. It's just, a way to, because think about it, you're going to read the whole book and not Rousseau's book, right? But I mean, your essay is about Plato, right? So I'm saying in your essay, try to find a quote that you really like, that you think is very important, or explain something that you're trying to explain yourself in your essay, right? And then possibly open up your essay or conclude with that. And that helps a lot to either anticipate or to make the point, right? To sort of summarize your argument with a powerful quote. So that's just a suggestion. Okay, and so my suggestion then, the final one is, how do you not exaggerate, right, with your direct citations? Because sometimes students will have, as I mentioned, like half of their essays are direct citations. That's just a little bit too much, right? So what I'd say is use indirect citations, right? You're free to use as many as you want. So in other words, explain it yourself, paraphrase it, right? All right, now, as I mentioned, this epigraph, this reference to Aristotle, although Aristotle and Rousseau have very different philosophies, okay? So nature here to Aristotle, he talks about nature, but Rousseau refers to nature for different reasons, but, that quote just happens to work for him, right? So that's why he's using it. But what matters a lot here is sort of this return to the primitive state, to a state of nature. Okay, it's not going back in time. We're going to try to clarify this throughout the class. But nature, we talked about the state of nature, right? With Locke. And with Rousseau, likewise, he is talking about this transition from the state of nature, right, going through state of war and then finally civil society. So that same story, and told by both Hobbes and Locke, okay, the conjectural history, right, not a historical account of how we moved from our natural state to whatever we have become. Whether that's good or bad is an entirely different question. But whatever it is that we are, right, how is it that we have become this thing, right? In other words, is it are we born good and then we become evil creatures, or are we born evil creatures and we become good creatures, and neither, right? You see that different philosophers give different answers to this question, but essentially this is a question of nature versus nurture, right? So are we born already with a certain morality and certain inclinations, etc., or do we learn everything from our peers and from our parents and from the public institutions, school, church, friends, community, everything, television, internet, right, everything. So do we have our own senses that we're born with them? Is there something intrinsic to humanity, right? In other words, are we by nature good, bad, neither? Okay, and do we change? Okay, so is it that we flip from good to evil or vice versa? And we'll see that we already looked at it very briefly with Locke. If you remember, Locke argues that there is actually a inherent sense we are inherently good. Locke argues, but it's so unstable. Remember last classes actually, right? It was more than one video, but if you remember, Locke argued that essentially we are born with some sort of inherent morality, but suddenly, right, he doesn't explain very well. It's just like that. Just in the blink of an eye, we move to the state of war, and we don't really understand very well how we transition, right, from one to the other one. That all happens in the same page I mentioned, right, basically. And Rousseau explains all of that in much more detail. Okay, he's going to argue basically that human beings are good by nature. Okay, that why is it, so if you could go back to the primitive man, although this is not a historical reconstruction, right? There's never a period here. He's never saying, oh, we were good in the 15th century, right? Or the 12th century or the 5th century. It's not like that. But what he's basically arguing is if we were to go back in time indefinitely, right? Trying to search for this sort of original man, right? Original men and women, I mean, mankind, humanity, right? What are we as people, right? In our natural condition, right? Before we enter society, as it were. So if there was someone like Robinson Crusoe, if you remember that story, right? That's not even a good example because Robinson Crusoe started from society and then he was stranded in an island, of course. But what I was thinking was if there were an island, right, with people living there in that island and they were completely isolated from society, okay, what would that people be? Would they be kind and cooperative or evil, right? Is it the case that, as Locke says, so civil society, helps people come together, right? Locke and Hobbes, they're arguing that the social contract, right, it guarantees this sort of stability, etc. Wasn't it that the argument? Although we were wolves to one another, Hobbes argued Leviathan could guarantee law and order and some sort of social stability, right? Rousseau is going to argue something a little bit different. He's going to say, well, we are inherently good, okay? So by nature we are good, and we will develop into greedy, competitive beings, right? That sort of envy each other in nature, right? In other words, that island I was mentioning, if there were that society that was isolated from everything, right, from all of us, that society, there would be cooperative, great people. Rousseau would argue, okay, he has this passion of the sauvage, all right? He thinks that human being in the natural state, in the original state, okay, so in the state of nature, human beings would be not like Hobbes evil, but actually great. And it is as we develop reason and as society develops and enters, not even capitalism, because that's before that. Rousseau is writing before the Industrial Revolution, before capitalism really. So it's not about capitalism really, but as we enter, as we form cities and as we move from these tribes and primitive societies and groups start getting bigger and bigger and bigger and we form groups, we start creating a sense of competition with one another, right? All of us, he argued, want to be the best, whatever we can. So it could be the best dancer, the fastest, the best in sports, the smartest, the prettiest, whatever, right? He has this example. Even in a primitive society, but as long as it's a large group, we would start to develop competition and etc., vanity. Okay, so we start as by nature we're good people, and then we're nurtured into we actually become these wolves, that story of Hobbes, that we are wolf to one another and that we compete and we want to kill one another. Rousseau is going to say that we do get there, not at the state of nature, really. That happens later. Okay, that's not the natural state, really. It's only after we develop language and develop reason and language that we can start creating concepts and the idea of hierarchy and of being better and worse, right? Primitive man doesn't have the notion of better or worse, because primitive men and primitive woman, whatever, right? I won't say men because otherwise it seems, but we usually say cavemen, but cavemen, cave women, whatever. Primitive society, they didn't have the concept of better and worse, right? They couldn't have it because eventually, right, evolutionarily speaking, if you keep going back and back and back, at some point we barely had even reason, right? Before we developed language, we couldn't have developed sense of competition and reason, etc., right? At least that's what Rousseau argues, right? And I think it's quite reasonable. Okay, so that's why nature, that he starts with Aristotle's epigraph and that reference to nature, right? He wants to, in some sense, restore, recuperate that natural kindness that we had and that we lost as we enter civil society, etc. Okay, so he wants to strip man's nature naked, right? If we could go back in time, right? It's not history, real history, but conjectural history, right? Hypothetical history, an as if history, right? If you could go back, because if you analyze any human being, right, any real person, and look at that person's behavior, and that person will be either selfish or altruistic and whatever it is. But now we don't really know if that person is altruistic or selfish because she became that, as a consequence of the world. Let's say, the world's a tough place and it's hard and competitive, and we all end up becoming, right, kind of too competitive and selfish, and we lose our sense of cooperate, our altruism, etc., because of the world around us, right? That's one possibility. Or maybe that person was already born like that, right? You can't, in other words, you don't really know if it's nature or nurture, right? When you observe current society. So Rousseau, in this conjectural history, is trying to go back in time, reverse the arrow, right? If we could strip men's from its nature, right? From everything that man's acquired through society, and if you could just see what man's actual nature is, right? When man is naked, in other words, what is his nature like, right? Naked from history, right? From everything that man has become due to society, right? When you strip man naked of everything that man wasn't originally and transformed into as a product of times, right? So it's trying to reverse the arrow of time, as it were. And Rousseau differently from Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, from the Greek, okay, basically he's going to argue it's not about justice and virtue and reason. Remember, the whole discussion with Plato and Socrates was how do we what is justice about, right? How do we become more virtuous? How do we become just and live the good life, right? That was the whole discussion for the Republic of Plato, and also the Apology, right? The other books, the dialogues we read, and reason, right? Reason. I'm saying reason, virtue, and justice. These three things, because it is through reason, isn't it, that you become virtuous and just. Remember the philosopher king and the philosopher queens. It took actually 50 years, right, of education until you became eligible, as it were, to become a king or a queen. You weren't born virtuous or just, right? It was a matter of using reason to become more virtuous and more just, of learning what they are and practicing it and becoming increasingly more just and more virtuous, etc., right? Becoming more excellent, right? In that sense. That's the most noble and principal thing in life. The main thing they were worried about, the Greek, right? But Rousseau is saying, no, the main, the most noble faculty is freedom. Okay, your freedom to become whatever you want. Even, your freedom to. He uses the word perfectibility. Okay, which is a weird word a little bit in English, but that's how it's translated because it's from the French, right, language. Of course, it's originally French. So, but perfectibility, your ability to become perfect, to improve, right? So this idea of your freedom to even reason, virtue, justice, all of these things, right? Rousseau is going to argue, no, before that you have freedom as the main thing, because it's all about what you choose, right? That's going to become more clear, I guess, when we read Stuart Mill and On Liberty, because Mill has kind of a similar idea of freedom of speech and liberty, and each person figuring out what's better for her own life, etc. But Rousseau is going to argue, the most noble faculty is really freedom, because essentially, if you weren't free to use your reason and even those things which he will agree that are important, virtue and justice and reason, but if you're forced to, right, if you're forced to be virtuous or just, then wouldn't even be possible, right? You can't even be forced to becoming those things. So it's interesting that it's a different thing, a different way. It's different from it's a different focus, right? That's my point, from Aristotle and Plato. Okay, and also very focused from Locke, and I want to compare him with Locke, of course, a lot here, because as this passage shows, the first person who, having enclosed the plot of ground, was the true founder of civil society. And if you continue reading this passage, and I'm sure you have, and you remember what Rousseau says afterwards, and if you don't, do read. But you see that Rousseau is extremely critical of private property, right? And you see Karl Marx here, that we'll see later, because Rousseau, obviously, he's not a communist, a socialist, anything like this, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But his context is before that again, right? So he's not necessarily criticizing Locke or Locke's context. Okay, it's a different historical context. We're going to talk about that in a second. But essentially, there are some similarities with Marx in this idea of the pernicious consequences of luxury, right? of competition, of greed, of vanity. So Rousseau is very skeptical in science in progress because, um, as I mentioned, he has this passionate view of the sort of pastoral life, bucolic life of the small communities, um, and shares similarities therefore with utopian socialists. But he also influenced the kibbutz in Israel and other um, communities. Fundamentally, Rousseau's idea of the social contract was different from Locke and Hobbes in that he thought that perfect society would have something that approached direct democracy, and therefore they would have to be small societies, so that they could come together and vote everything and decide together, right? Coming together. He basically thought that he didn't see how it would be possible with very large cities, right, for us to have a real democracy. That's his idea was. He was from Geneva, and he opens his book dedicating to the city of Geneva, and he argues later that that's the best example of what a um, that's the best example of of the ideal or closest that's the closest example to the ideal society that he has in mind, because precisely as I mentioned, it's a relatively small society that comes together and vote everything. Switzerland is still like that to a large extent nowadays. They still vote on several things, so they have referendums a lot over there, right? And people actually do. So not only obviously elect presidents and etc., but they also directly vote on a lot of policies when they're policies that are very relevant to the people, is actually voted by referendum even nowadays. So that's kind of the ideal society. It doesn't have to be socialism. That's what I was saying before. Although it shares similarities with utopian socialists, and it shares similarity also with Marx and etc. But the main point here is the idea of society being a community that is homogeneous enough and small enough that they can come together and vote, so that in order the social contract we've been talking about, right? As we've mentioned, it's just a theoretical construct, right? But if let's imagine the Constitution as representing this social contract to some extent, okay, the bigger the country is, the hardest, like the Constitution, the more heterogeneous and diverse people are, the hardest it becomes to pass laws that will make everyone happy, right? That's just obvious. So Rousseau is saying the ideal society that he has in mind is this small society. But that's also because, as I said, he's very skeptical of progress. He thinks that technology is obviously great on one sense, right? Because I mean, there are advantages to technology. That's just obvious, to innovation, etc. But he sees that as society progresses, as we're moving forward, he thinks that we're becoming more and more vain right? And more worried about our place in society, as it were. Okay, like what, um, if we're famous or not, if we make a lot of money or not, if people think we're smart or not. So he thinks that the more as time moves on, we're getting increasingly, because competition can be good or bad, right? So he's saying competitive, but in a bad way, in terms of vanity, okay, in terms of, and in a way losing um, touch with what really matters. Okay, that's the sense in which he likes. He's kind of passionate about the savage. It's not that he wants, he really thinks, oh, let's go back to the year 300 when we were all right, when we lived 30 years on average and we are all killing each other. It's not that, but he's saying in the sort of metaphorical sense, right? Let's go back to what like, of course, keep everything we have nowadays, right? He's not saying that, he wants to go back to the savage in that sense of let's go back to doing human sacrifices, anything like that. That's not the idea, of course. The idea is, can can we, go back in time, if as it were, and strip back everything we've acquired, all of these bad traits we've acquired, and um, just focus on the sort of bucolic, simple life, right? So, if you want, like, I guess one example of it, like, what's the closest thing we have today that looks a little bit like what Rousseau is saying, would be something like the Amish or the Mennonites, right? That's a little bit the idea here, in the sense, this idea of, oh, let's not use technology and um, live a simple life. Okay, we live in community, and we're not trying to get rich, etc., but just focus um, on friendship, on social relationships, on our community, without necessarily trying to grow or become richer, etc. That's kind of Rousseau's mindset there, so that we preserve that original kindness that we had and that we lost. Okay. Um, just a fun fact here also is that as you see here, he wrote an opera. Okay, so which is very uncommon for a writer, for a philosopher, or for because I mean it's extremely complex to. Um, Operas are extremely complex, right? Because well, you know what an opera is. I don't have to explain why it's complex, but one of the interesting facts or the funny stories of Rousseau's life. There are many, really. He has a very funny life. Like there's these funny stories that happen. I'm not going to go into it, but one of the only one I want to talk about is that he became extremely famous and extremely rich because of his opera. He became extremely famous. It's said that the king, which was a terrible musician, he couldn't sing, he couldn't play, had no sense of rhythm, that people saw him whispering the melody of this opera here, Le Devant du Village. And he's saying that the king, it was seen that the king was seen whispering. It said the king wanted to have Rousseau to teach him music. But either way, he became extremely rich. I was talking about how he had this idea of simple life, etc., living in the field, and very bucolic, right? And ironically, right, he becomes this very rich. And he mentions that when he watches the premiere of his own opera, and he's at the theater, and obviously it's the high society of friends, right? So rich people watching the premiere, and Rousseau, is later recalling that he felt horrible there, that he just felt like, oh, I definitely don't belong here. This is not my place. That's not the sort of life that he wanted, right? So it's very funny that he was passionate about music, and it's a great accomplishment to write an opera, and you can listen to it obviously on YouTube or whatever you listen to music. I don't know, but if you want to. But the point here, it's funny, right, that he's there with the elite, right, with a lot of rich people, and he feels like, oh, I don't want to be part of this, so he gives up on music and never writes music again because it was such a success that he's basically, well, if I write music, then I have to, I don't want to be part of these networks of people, etc. That's how he felt about it. So I think that's very funny that he was. Most people in life are just trying to become super famous, right? And it's so funny that Rousseau, his first opera, he does it and he hates it, and also, I mentioned how the king wanted him to be his private tutor, teach him music, etc. And he offered Rousseau a fat salary, right? Obviously, I'll pay you whatever you want. I love your music, huh? And Rousseau says, no, I don't want that, right? Obviously, his friends, how can you turn that down? It's so much money. And Rousseau, no, I don't want any of that. Like, that doesn't. Well, anyway, that's a strange thought for most of us, I guess, but I think it's very interesting. So at least, I guess we can all say, well, because oftentimes, I mean, maybe you could say, well, maybe Rousseau was very poor, like Socrates, right? And that's why he's saying that he would rather have that simple life. Maybe it's because he has never accomplished anything, right? But that's not the case, right? He did actually become rich, and he hated it. So, it's something he actually believed in. All right, so a bit about his context, as you know. I just wanted to clarify this, that his context is that of the ancient regime, and of Louis XIV. L'état c'est moi, I am the state, right? He said. So that's Rousseau's context, okay? The context of kings and queens, etc. So, in other words, because it would seem like it's a straight rejection from Locke, right? He's very critical of private property, okay? Remember that, quote, the first person who, having enclosed a plot of ground, was the true founder of civil society. And that's when things go south, right? That's when all problems start. When we establish private property, Rousseau is going to argue, that's when we start competing with each other, etc. Because, once we establish private property, now there's the possibility that my land is bigger than your land, etc. So we can start competing and then fighting with each other, right, etc. Compete in a bad way. So it's interesting also that private property for Locke is fundamental and it's great, etc. Right? He looks at all of the positive consequences of private property, and to Rousseau, it's a bit different, the story, right? So, so you would think, well. So he is the nemesis of Locke, right? He is criticizing the sort of the sort of modern world we live in. No, he's not, because he's not part of that. Okay, he's writing before that. So he is against essentially kings and queens. Okay, so those criticisms that he's making, they apply to the Paris of the world he lived in, which is pre-capitalism, right? So that's not what he's criticizing exactly, not the commercial society, etc. It's before that, right? It's I mean, if you contrast Geneva, right, Geneva with Paris, he would say that Paris is already a city where it's too big and people are trying to become part of the elite, etc., etc. Whereas those small communities had a better possibility of working and being actual democracies, right? Which was what he was really worried about. Um, so he is important for the French Revolution. Okay, so to keep comparing the comparison with Locke, you can say that if Locke was so important for the founding fathers, right, and for the American Revolution, it's equally the case that Rousseau was very important for the French Revolution. Okay, and it's very interesting here because if you compare the United States with France nowadays, right, it doesn't have to be like it didn't have to be like that. I'm not saying that that's a necessary consequence of what happened around this period, but I just want you to realize that if you contrast the U.S. and France, you can still see a little bit the differences between Locke and Rousseau in these two countries, right? In other words, France is still a country that favors more redistribution, where you see protests very, very often, where people are more favorable to the state, etc. Whereas the United States, like John Locke, favors liberty, right? Private property, etc. Right? So not only all I'm saying is I'm not saying it's going to be like this forever and it's always been like this and it's inevitable, nothing like that. But it's very interesting that Locke and Rousseau were fundamental for, respectively, the US and France, and to some extent, these two countries, right, they still reflect a little bit, right? When you look at the differences between Locke and Rousseau, you see a little bit, right? The differences between the US and France. That's very interesting. So, so just keep in mind, of course, that the danger of anachronism, right? So don't. I don't want you to think that Rousseau is criticizing capitalism, okay? Because he didn't even see it. He's living in France, okay? At that time, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take shape in England, but not necessarily in France. So he's not right. We're gonna get to Adam Smith much later. We'll see how Adam Smith, he is a product of capitalism, of the Industrial Revolution, right? Adam Smith is writing precisely where the Industrial Revolution is beginning, and so he's starting to see what capitalism looks like. And then obviously Marx is going to be also a product of that, right? Of that context. But this is before that happened, right? So you can speculate and say, well, Rousseau would probably be a Marxist. We don't know, maybe. Okay, it's more definitely more similar to Marx than to Adam Smith, what he's saying, but that's an anachronistic simply because, well, what if Rousseau lived, right, 100 years later in a different country, and due to this different context, he had completely different views? Isn't it possible? It is possible, right? So you can't say that, although there are some similarities with utopian socialists, etc., you just can't say that he would necessarily criticize capitalism, because maybe maybe if he had seen capitalism and lived it, maybe he would think, oh, this is actually great, right? You just don't know, so you shouldn't claim that. There was a lot of criticism. He was friends with Voltaire and the sort of luminaires of his period, people from the Enlightenment, and You can see here Voltaire saying, "I have received, sir, your new book against the human race, for which I thank you. No one has ever used so much intelligence to try to render us beasts. When one reads your works, it stirs a desire to walk on all fours." So, obviously, the reactions weren't always favorable, to say the least. And and that's quite understandable because he's essentially, as I mentioned, not criticizing capitalism, but criticizing civilization, modern civilization, right? The civilization of his times. So Voltaire and other people involved in the Enlightenment and etc. So, believed in right reason and progress, science, and Rousseau was somewhat skeptical of that, as I just explained. Um, so, to steal Sigmund Freud's title, Civilization and Its Discontents, that could also work as Rousseau's title, right, of his book. It's roughly what he's talking about in his book. He used the word inequality, so it's discourse on inequality, right? Rousseau. But why? So why is inequality so important? Because society's becoming more larger, more diverse, and more heterogeneous, and more unequal, right? Some people are richer than others, but again, it's not a capitalism against capitalism thing. That's before capitalism. But as he starts to observe these differences, right? He's going to center his discussion on how these inequalities that exist are dangerous because people essentially live like sad lives, depressed lives, trying to ever become something that is just impossible because they're constantly trying to get better and better and better and better, never happy with who they are, right? So we're so more or less reasoning along these terms. Nowadays, it seems a bit strange to us, right? Perhaps you're thinking like, oh, that sounds like, I don't know, like hippie, right? Oh, let's go to live in the middle of nature and etc. And yes, it's a little bit like that. But that's even before capitalism, right? So that's what you have to keep in mind. But to some extent, I mean, obviously, that's not. It's a short book, but still, it's a beautiful book with several brilliant ideas, and he's part of social contract theory, etc., etc. But the book does somewhat revolve around this idea of how inequalities are exacerbated by civil society. Okay, so think about it. While Locke is saying private property is great, and that's one of the fundamental rights we have, and the state needs to protect it, etc., etc. Rousseau is worried about the consequences of property, inequality, and all those, right? And how these lead us to compete more than we should, as it were, right? And it's very funny, the story of how he thought about all of that, right? He explains at the very beginning of the book that he had sort of a revelation. He was walking around and he sat under a tree, right? And then he had this sort of vision. And he says, if ever I could have written a quarter of what I saw and felt under that tree. So he's saying that everything that he's telling you on the discourse on inequality, he had this insight where he had this almost like nirvana moment, like this Buddha moment, where he felt what it's like to be free for real, right? At that moment where he sort of disconnected with everything, almost like a meditation thing, okay? And he said he disconnected from everything and he could sort of feel what human beings were like the real nature of, right? Imagine if you could, for a second or for a minute, whatever, disconnect with everything, right? With everything you've learned and from the prejudices you have, etc., and just see the essence of your personality, if that exists, right? You may think, no, we're the blank slate and we don't really have a nature. We learn everything. That's fine, right? Maybe that's what you feel, sure. But Rousseau is arguing that he was able to see, right? And the book is not even the whole vision he had there because he can't remember all of it. It's quite strange that there aren't many books that the person said that the person had a vision and felt everything like that. But remember, I mentioned how freedom was the fundamental thing, right? That freedom is freedom from society in a sense, right? From the pressures. It's not free living alone like Robinson Crusoe, right? Or like that film Into the Wild. I'm not sure you've watched that film. So it's not like that. Let's go to Alaska and go right and live by ourselves in nature. It's no, not by ourselves, but essentially, Rousseau is saying that if we could free ourselves from all of these things that are imposed to us by other people, right? Not things that we really want for ourselves, but right. That's an internal discussion, right? Like, to what extent do you do what you do because you really want it, or because you feel pressured to do that because, right, otherwise, oh, what would people say, etc., etc. We obviously feel some pressure to do certain things, right? There's certain rules, right? More explicit, more implicit, but there are certain rules, and there's obviously flexibility, and there's some flexibility for you to be who you want to be, but there are obviously certain rules that we all respect, right? But that idea of freedom being the most noble thing is because Rousseau thinks that before we developed reason and and language and started competing and creating concepts and creating the notion that something is better than the other one, we were once free. And he felt that under that tree. Okay, now there's one thing you see here, which is a matrix, and you see G and B. Let me just try to explain this to you. Now, G and B here stand for good and bad. So sort of, if you're altruistic, if you're good, right? Or if you're bad, sort of, if you're selfish, or right, if you're just trying to become famous or whatever, and you don't care about other people, that's kind of bad, evil, whatever. It's just a way to say, good or bad. Now, Rousseau essentially is arguing that we are good by nature, but we can become bad because of society. Okay, so if you could live in a society like Geneva in Switzerland, and this small city that everyone, right? Everyone is pretty rich there, as you know. There aren't many, like, how can I put this? There aren't obviously there are problems everywhere, but there aren't the typical problems you'd see in South America and in Brazil, where I come from, right? There isn't a lot of poverty, etc. So people have a high level of income, as I mentioned, right? They come together and decide everything. They have kind of a direct democracy, right? Etc. etc. So if you were to, Rousseau's going to argue, if you were to live in let's say, in the ideal city, then it would be possible for us to retain, right, that sort of virtue we inherit from nature. So we were born good, right? We're good people. We're altruistic, etc. And we could continue good if we lived in Geneva, more or less, right, or in a ideal society. Okay, but most likely they're not. For most of us, right, we just become evil because we're, that idea of power corrupts, and absolute Power absolutely corrupts. So that's basically what he's saying. We live in societies and we're corrupted by the structure of societies we live in, right? So basically, if you look at this matrix here, it's telling you, right? Locke, for example, okay, is saying, well, we actually were born good, right? In the state of nature, we were inherently good. We were altruistic, cooperative, etc. But then it quickly that degenerated into the state of a war of all against all. And then with the social contract and the civil state, etc., we are allowed, we manage to guarantee the life, liberty, and property that we were born with, right? That nature gave us, right? So the social contract is nothing but society reestablishing that which nature had given it, but it had lost, okay? And Rousseau is saying the opposite, right? That yes, we are born good, but then as we enter into society, the societies we live in, we become competitive and selfish, etc. Okay, so that idea of power corrupts. All of us become selfish just because our cities are like that, and we become a product of our times, right? So Plato, Socrates, so I'm saying Greek here, the first thing we were looking at, module 1, right? The first thing we were looking at, so the ancient Greek. So Plato and Socrates especially, but if you look at Aristotle, they would argue that we're bad by nature and then we become good through education. It's not that we are bad in the sense that we're evil. But what Plato is arguing, okay, is that, remember the cave, right? That cave, that's the crucial idea here. Originally, we are ignorant. We're not seeing things as they actually are, right? But we're just seeing the appearances of reality. We can't see the essence of things, isn't it? We are not born just and virtuous. We need to learn what justice is. We need to learn how to become virtuous. We have to become a philosopher, king of queen. So we need to become good. We're not born good, you see. So good here, I mean in the sense of just, right? The just and the correct thing to do, justice and virtue. That's the idea of good and bad here. So we're born ignorant, right? To Plato and Socrates, and therefore bad. Not that we're evil, okay, but simply that as long as we're ignorant, as let's say as a young person, okay, a young person cannot be a politician, because a young person is ignorant, and a young person is going to make bad decisions, right? Decisions which are evil, as it were, not because that person is evil, but simply because that person doesn't really know what justice is, what's the right thing to do, right? So the Plato and Socrates, we are born without the intellectual capacities to do good stuff, because we're not yet virtuous, okay? We're not excellent, we're not just, we don't know what those things are, we have to practice it. That's what Socrates is doing in the Republic, trying to figure it out and practicing it, right? By dialoguing and dialectics. But the idea is by practicing and learning and studying, you become increasingly better and you become virtuous and a just person. And eventually you leave the cave. That's what the whole allegory of the cave is. That you become good by nurturing knowledge and the correct kind of knowledge, right? Because, I mean, that's a whole discussion there of what specifically you should read. I'm not going to get into that. That's, in the Republic there's some debate about that. But so you nurture virtue and justice, and in other terms, goodness, right? Because that's the opposite of evil, and that's in this sense of that's what I was talking about when I was talking about reason, virtue, and justice, right? As being together, you become just by using your reason to nurture certain virtues and certain, the understanding of what excellent is. So you see, you go from bad to good. You see, so this is the process of how where you're in this matrix. You can show the position of each one of the authors. We're obviously not looking at Machiavelli, but sometimes I mention this fact that Machiavelli would be perhaps the only one here where he has this skeptical vision of people being like Hobbes. He thinks that people are nasty, and Hobbes has the famous sentence that in the state of war, life is nasty, solitary, brutal, brutish, and short. And Machiavelli also has this notion of, right, killing one another, and we're wolves to each other. But if you remember, Hobbes would also fit here like the Greek, in the sense that, yes, we're wolves to one another, so we're bad, but then the state, right, Leviathan, forces us into being good, right? Because of the police and because of coercion power, the state can force us into behaving accordingly, right? So we're born bad, but we act accordingly because of the state, right? So Hobbes also could be here together with the Greek. But Machiavelli would be the only one, if you read The Prince, which we are in, which says, yes, we are selfish and competitive, etc., etc. And the Prince is a pretty, well, not pretty virtuous person, let's say, in the Greek sense, right? But we're not going to talk about the book. But Machiavelli is basically arguing that as long as that the prince, can be pretty cruel and violent when the prince has to be cruel and violent in order to guarantee the stability of her kingdom or etc. So, in other words, it's okay to be evil. That's sort of what Machiavelli is saying. You must have heard the Machiavellian, that expression, right? So, okay, we're not going to talk about that, but he would be the only one that fits here. Okay, so this is a way for you to understand the difference between Rousseau and Locke and Plato, especially. Okay, so I think it's a cool representation. We get to talk about all of them at the same time. So Rousseau, to a certain extent, can also be thought of as an evolutionary philosopher, right? This idea of how did we become what we are, right? So basically he's looking at society at his time. Remember when he went to the opera and he was like, oh, I won't, when did things turn wrong, right? He had a very pessimistic view of his days, saying, the good old days, that idea, right? It used to be better. We used to be better as, as a species, more cooperative, etc., etc. So he's trying to understand, evolutionarily speaking, as it were, how we became increasingly more competitive, right? That's one way of thinking about it. And that's very different from, just to compare him directly with Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. Obviously, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates are different, but relative to Rousseau, they're, a group. You can think about them as a group relative to Rousseau, that is. In the sense that they all had this notion of teleology, right? I just mentioned that Rousseau is a kind of cultural philosopher or evolutionary philosopher, right? And I'm just contrasting that with teleology, where teleology is that notion that there is an end. Okay, there's an end to life and an end result, and there's something that you're trying to figure out. You see here the target happiness. So as I mentioned, you were born bad, but you can become good, right? So you can become happy. So happy here for Greek, for Greek philosophers is complicated. It's not happiness as we think of. It's not pleasure or anything like this. But the happy life, okay, is not a life of partying or anything like that for Aristotle and Plato, right? They use happiness in a peculiar way, relative to what we use nowadays. But and I'm not going to explain what it is. But basically, this happy life or this good life is essentially what we've been talking about as the virtuous and just life. Okay, you can just think about it like that. They thought that the happy life is the life of the philosopher. The happiest life, the best possible life, is that of the philosopher king. Okay, basically that life when you're using reason, and that's the, if you can rank different kinds of pleasures, right? They would argue that intellectual satisfaction comes before anything else. So that's what happiness is supposed to represent here. Okay, but teleology is essentially the idea that there is an end. Okay, you must have heard the expression Judeo-Christian values, right? Western civilization. And so you may like or not like these ideas, but you must have heard that, right? But I'll try to explain that roughly here. That tradition, which starts in Greece, right, and goes through, starts in roughly in Greece, right, with Socrates, etc. But we call it Judeo-Christian because with the Torah and then the Bible, as the Roman Empire adopts Christianity and this spreads throughout Europe and United States and many parts of the world, right? Also Africa, South America, etc. The whole world, not the whole world, obviously, is, but you will find Christians anywhere probably in the world, right? In most parts of the world, you find someone at least. So it spread, this idea of Western civilization being influenced by the Judeo-Christian values. There's a lot in there to unpack, which I'm not going to get into in details, but part of it, and this idea of teleology, is essentially the idea that there is an end and there is a purpose, okay, and there is therefore a destiny. That's what you have to understand, okay. So from the religious point of view, the idea is that there is the right way for you to live your life, respecting the laws, right, the commandments. So whatever your religion is, it could be Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or whatever it is, but whatever you are, there are laws that right. There are certain laws, right, and rules that if you're religious, that you think, well, I should behave this way and respect these laws because then I'll go to a certain place, right, in the afterlife. So there is a destiny, okay, and these ideas fed directly into science, and you'll find them everywhere because more likely than not, scientific theories are teleological in the sense that they're trying to figure out what the end is, what the destiny is, right? So for the Greek, they're teleological in the sense that there's a target, right? There's a right way of approaching your life, right? And there's a right way of being just and of being virtuous, etc., right? Maybe you've heard people speaking of postmodernism and an idea of everything goes. That's not really what it is, but just for the sake of the argument, that would be a completely different way of thinking about it, right? Which is, so this idea of to contrast it with evolution, okay, which is the point that I'm making here. In evolutionary theory, or Darwin, there's the notion that of a tree that branches out, right? That history, it doesn't necessarily have a destiny, right? But that anything can happen in the future, and there's uncertainty, and we don't know, right? So mankind is is evolving, and not only mankind, but all of and the animal kingdom, etc., is evolving without having an end point or a destination, right? That would be an evolutionary perspective, right? And that's a very uncommon way of thinking within most of political philosophers and political economists, etc. Right? Um, and Rousseau isn't really teleological in that sense. He's not going to advocate for any kind of good life, etc. Right? He's basically going to argue, well, you're free to, be yourself, whatever you want to be. So he would support individualism and people's, because Plato in the Republic, right? He's arguing this is the good life, right? This is the way to live the good life. This is how you become virtuous, and there's just one way. This is the target. There's just one way for you to live the best possible life. And Rousseau is not going to argue anything like this. Okay, so he would be more of an evolutionary philosopher in this sense, that he would think, no, if society is not bound to perfection or anything like that. Will constantly keep evolving forever, and it's up for each people to decide what they want to be, etc., etc. So it's a very different way to think about political philosophy relative to not only Plato and Aristotle, but most of political philosophers, I would argue. Okay, so a quote here. A state where all private individuals being known to one another, neither the obscure maneuvers of vice or the modesty of virtue could be hidden from the notice and the judgment of the public, and where that pleasant habit of seeing and knowing one another turned love of homeland into love of the citizens rather than into the love of land. Okay, so this is John Locke here, but the quote is from Rousseau, so I'm just contrasting it. Okay, I'm showing you Locke here because you can see the difference, right? So love of citizens rather than love of the land. Remember the quote that I mentioned way back then, I don't know, 20 minutes ago or whatever it was, when I talked about private property, right, when it was installed. So this is the kind of world that Rousseau is envisioning here, right? That small society I talked about, all private individuals known to one another, right? Something like Geneva, right? He dedicates the book to the city of Geneva, and he, explicitly says that that's the best city he can think of, right? Because it would have this sort of characteristic, right? Here you see a picture of Geneva, in case you've never been there. I would therefore have sought for my homeland a happy and tranquil republic where the citizens were not only free but worthy of being so. Okay, so you see, he does have he studied Aristotle and Plato, and he does think it's important to be excellent and virtuous and just, etc. Right? So I just want to outline that, right? That's what I'm highlighting here. Not only here, but worthy of being free. So he's not saying freedom for the sake of freedom, right? But freedom so we can, become better people, the freedom to become increasingly better versions of ourselves, right? But not progress in the typical way we think about it. No, he's not so worried about technological progress or income or growth of GDP, etc., but sort of, the growth of our morality, right? So we can become better as a community, as a people, not just as individuals. That's what he's thinking about. Okay, that doesn't mean anarchy, right? Just to make that clear. So you can see here, above all, I would have fled as necessarily ill-governed a republic where the people, believing it could get along without its magistrates. Okay, so obviously, just so you can understand. He's not saying, because he is saying something like a direct democracy where everyone votes and gets it, but that doesn't mean, oh, let's abolish the state, right? Because you see, the temptation is, oh, he just wants, what he's talking about, like, um, creating an alternative state or whatever, parallel state. Let's destroy the constitution. Is that what Rousseau is saying? Let's burn the constitution. Let's destroy the state. Let's just live like, in in villages and etc. No, let's not go that so far. Okay, he's obviously saying, if people think that they can live without their magistrates, they're crazy. I would have fled, okay, that republic. So just to make it clear that he is talking about a republic and a direct democracy, he's simply making the point that small communities will manage to do that much more successfully, right? Then, because he lived in Paris and he thought Paris, right, wasn't really the model he had in mind, whereas in a place like Geneva, that would be a lot easier to accomplish. Okay, now, um, I want to use the if you remember from the Republic, everything is divided in three there, isn't it? I've mentioned before how we have everything is divided in three in society. We have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, right? Um, but you have the three egos in Freud. Um, you have three primary colors. Ever thought about that? Every color in the world is derived from one of the three primary colors. Remember when you were a kid in school? Yellow, red, and blue, right? Those are the only three colors that exist in nature. Yellow, red, and blue, the three primary colors. And then you mix yellow and red and you create a new color. Do you remember this? Yellow and blue, blah, blah, blah. So every time you mix two colors and three colors, and then you mix them up and you create everything else, right? But isn't it interesting that everything is divided in three, and then the republic, you see that everywhere in the structure, right? The city is divided in three, the soul is divided in three, there are three main virtues, the body is divided in three, everything is divided in three, right? So remember that the brain, okay, the heart and the intestine, right, they correspond to reason, uh, to emotion, to appetite, into your emotions, loyalty, etc. Right? The three, and you had also the three parts of the state, of course, wasn't it? The guardians, the philosopher, kings and queens. Then you had the workers. Okay, you remember all of that, right? If you don't go back to that video. But I just want to make that parallel here because what I want to do here is the three guys we've been thinking about, they also correspond to each one of them. Okay, that's basically what we've been talking about the whole time here, but I wanted to, if you didn't understand the major point of the lecture, let me try to make it again more forcefully now with a few examples. But basically my idea is Aristotle would be the equivalent of the brain in the sense that he sees human nature in terms of this political animal, right? It's all about reason, right? Using reason to become more virtuous and more just and living the excellent life, living the good life, becoming, you are born ignorant and you only see the shadow of things when you're inside the cave. We don't really understand the essence of reality, right? We're materialistic. We only see the material expressions of things, but we aren't able to provide the abstract concept that represents stuff, right? Remember when I talked about the chair? There are a million different kinds of chair, and we understand what a chair is, right? But the essence of the chair is hard to define. We know what it is, but it's a bit hard to define, right? But if you are the philosopher king or philosopher queen, you're really good at seeing the essence of things, right? The chair is something you sit on, etc., right? But it doesn't have to be a made of wood or metal or whatever it is. Okay, anyways, we've talked about that as well. But if Aristotle is the equivalent of the brain with the political animal. Locke would be the equivalent of the intestine, right? The warriors that protect the philosopher kings and queens, because he emphasizes the property, isn't it? So human being not so much as the political animal. Remember when I said that Locke turns Plato upside down? Okay, but here Plato, Aristotle's, right? Let's just think about the Greeks in general. I mentioned that before. They're different. Aristotle and Plato, they're different animals, right? But for the sake of my argument here, they're the same. Just think about the Greek, right? They're about reason and becoming more virtuous, just, etc., right? Now, remember when I mentioned that Locke turns Plato and Aristotle upside down because he, in the Republic, right, the working class, right, was the least interesting from Plato's point of view, but Locke saying, no, property is so central, right, life, liberty, and property, blah, blah, blah. The estate, he doesn't use the word property, but that's what he's talking about, right? So he would represent the workers and the intestine, and the intestine here is your instinct, right? Your greed, your instinct, right? And finally, Rousseau, what we're talking about today, would be the third and the last one, right? The heart, therefore, the emotional animal. Okay, remember the Wizard of Oz? That's the good example. Remember we saw that? So there you go. So right, so the Tin Man and the lion and the right the scarecrow. So think about those three, right? The brain, the heart, the intestine, etc. Or the blood, right, would be one of them. But so the point here is that Rousseau would be the heart, right? And would be right. So would be. Because again, it's not reason, okay? Like, what's the most important thing to Rousseau, right? It's not the brain, and one argue, not reason, but emotions and the heart. That's what we are, okay? Or originally, I want to show you this very briefly. So this passage here. You see, nature in giving men tears bears witness that she gave the race the softest hearts. That's Rousseau, arguing that in the state of nature, in our essence, okay, is to have soft hearts and to be right. What makes us so? The point here is he's trying to explain what the so Rousseau's trying to explain what is the difference between men and other animals. All right, Rousseau is going to argue that reason makes us different. This ability of becoming a political animal, right? That I mean, we are to some extent already born, right, as a political animal. We just have to obviously learn and develop it and become more just and more virtuous throughout our lives. But what makes us different from animals, the Greek would argue, is reason, right? The faculty of reason and our capacity of becoming smart, right? Just, excellent, virtuous, etc., right? But Rousseau argues, no, that's not the case. What makes us different from animals is our ability to cry. Animals can't cry, he argues. Right? That's what's different from us. He basically makes a very interesting argument. He says, actually, we can't really develop reason. What Aristotle and Plato talk about, we can't actually develop reason before we develop language. Think about it. How can you become smarter or learn anything without language, right? The Homo sapiens and the Neanderthal, if you go back thousands of years to the beginning of right humanity, before we developed language, we were right. We were smart to some extent. We could do something. It's not that we didn't have any capacity to reason, right? But essentially, Rousseau is arguing before we had language, we couldn't really do much or accomplish much, right? We can only fully develop reason, right, our faculty of reason after we develop language. Okay, it's not something inherent to humankind, he's arguing, as Aristotle claims, but something that we acquire lately, right? That's the sense in which he's sort of an evolutionary philosopher, as I was arguing. He's basically going to argue that we've always been emotional beings, that Stone Age men would cry, but they wouldn't be political animals yet, because they wouldn't. It's not that they wouldn't reason, right? They would reason, because even animals reason to some extent, right? It's not that they don't reason, but what makes us human beings and what makes us different, he's going to argue, is not that we are far superior in intelligence compared to other animals. We will eventually become extremely smart, right? And we will eventually become rational beings, but we weren't originally, right? We become increasingly more and more rational, increasingly more and more political animals, he's arguing. And that's only after we did. Think about it. The fact itself of the written word of developing the alphabet, right, and being able to write books, and etc., was so important for the development of knowledge and technology, wasn't it? Because before we could write and read, right, we had the oral tradition, but obviously it's a lot harder to keep track of everything if you can't write things down. So even the fact that we developed writing was so fundamental for the development of technology, science, etc., everything. So think just one step before that, right? The development of language itself, which was thousands of years before we developed writing. How influential that must have been for the development of reason, etc., right? So that's what Rousseau is doing, okay? Going way back, as far, stripping human's nature naked, right? Going all the way back there. And he's going to say that it's the human heart which makes us unique. That's quite peculiar. So contra Aristotle, he argues that reason is what engenders egocentrism, right? It turns man upon himself. And we've talked about that. Although it might be appropriate for Socrates and minds of his stature to acquire virtue through reason, the human race would long have ceased to exist if its preservation had depended solely on the reasonings of its members. And he's like, okay, think about this. 5,000 years ago, and we hadn't even developed language yet, right? And you're walking in the middle of a jungle, and a lion, right, is running after you, right? It's not through deliberation and through reason and the political animal. That's not right. He's saying, no, you have instinct and emotions, and you run for your life, etc., right? At one point, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, it wasn't the political animal, right, which mattered. It wasn't the republic, okay? It wasn't members of a republic getting together and voting in the political system and political institutions. It was not that which led to the preservation of society in the earlier stages, okay? So that's the point we'll be making. And then, again, of course, against Locke, we've already read that passage, right, of the plot of ground. But he continued, but also just to make the point a bit further, inequality must increase in the human species through inequality occasioned by social institutions. So again, right, whereas Locke sees private property is central and the benefits of it, Rousseau is looking at the half-empty glass, if you will. So what is his vision of society, or his dream? Is to live peacefully in, where fellow citizens can move towards humanity and friendship and a virtuous life. leaving behind the memory of a good man and a decent and virtuous patriot. Okay, that's the vision of society that he has. Okay, so this video is already getting a little bit long, so I'm going to stop here, and the second part is going to be a lot shorter than the first part, but there's still a few things I want to say. So that's about it for the first part, and we'll be back and wrap up with the second part of this video. Thank you.